What if Albert Einstein, champion of science, reason, and relativity, left behind an unpublished formula, not for physics, but for the soul? A sealed document, marked confidential in 1925, remained buried in a private archive for nearly a century. Inside it, a thought experiment that challenges everything we believe about death, time, and identity. Not a metaphor, not philosophy, an actual equation for survival beyond the body. You weren't supposed to hear about this, and for nearly 100 years, you didn't. It began in the winter of 1924. Einstein was already the most famous scientist on Earth. The general theory of relativity had reshaped how humanity understood space, time, and gravity. But behind the fame, behind the equations, was something else. A question he never stopped asking. What happens to consciousness when the body disappears? Most people assume Einstein dismissed such ideas, that he was purely materialist, a man of hard logic. But that version was for public consumption. Privately, his letters tell a different story. One of frustration, one of unfinished business. In a letter to a colleague, later archived at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Einstein wrote of a problem he couldn't let go of. Not in the equations of electromagnetism, not in the behavior of matter, but in the continuity of subjective presence. That's not a phrase you'll find in his published work. Between 1924 and 1925, something changed. According to diary fragments and newly uncovered correspondence, Einstein began sketching what he called a non-physical extension of field theory, not to explain light, but to account for something he called the retained observer. This was never meant for publication. The notes, part physics, part metaphysics, were kept separate from his scientific manuscripts. Only a few people knew about them: a close friend in Zurich, a junior physicist in Berlin, and a woman who appears in only one footnote. Her name, Elsa Bamberger, a researcher in psychological physics, exiled from academia for her theories on cognitive survivorship. By 1930, the trail went cold. The letters stopped. The drafts disappeared. And Einstein never mentioned it again. Until now. Because in 2024, a declassified archival release from the Max Planck Institute revealed something long sealed, a single-page fragment, untitled, undated, signed only with an initial. But the handwriting is unmistakable. It describes a conceptual bridge between entropy, memory, and something else, something Einstein labeled Persistenzfeld, the persistence field, a structure beyond the limits of decay. And that's where this story begins. Not with an answer, but with a door someone tried very hard to keep closed. And that brings us to what Einstein never dared publish, at least not in the journals you're allowed to read. The notebook begins innocently, a winter evening in February of 1925. Einstein's elegant handwriting sketches a term not found in any published paper: Persistenzfeld. Not gravity, not electromagnetism. This was something else entirely. He wrote of a field, invisible yet structured, designed to carry more than energy. It carried identity. Einstein understood deeply that energy never vanishes. Heat becomes motion. Matter changes form. The laws of thermodynamics are absolute. Yet, in his private reflections, he asked, what if consciousness is no different? What if our memories, or the observer, the essence of who we are, leave an imprint, a persistent resonance that survives the body's decay? Under the heading Entropy Duality, he sketched a waveform looped back on itself. He called it a resonant structure, suggesting that identity, once established, echoes beyond physical termination. To Einstein, this wasn't poetic speculation. It was rooted in conservation principles. No mass, no energy. Instead, pattern. You might recognize the idea in quantum information theory, where data isn't lost even when particles vanish. Some call it the no-hiding theorem. Others name potential cosmic memory fields. His insight came decades before these theories emerged. In his draft, he described the persistence field as an extension of relativity. Just as gravitational fields shape the flow of space-time, this field would shape the persistence of subjective presence. It would be the architecture of ongoing identity. He sketched a diagram with two intersecting curves, a phase diagram perhaps, where biological decay meets information resonance. One curve moves toward disorder, the other loops it back toward recognition. The field appears at the junction. Einstein never attached a value, no constant. But there was a variable, simply labeled m, written in the margins with deliberate emphasis. Beside it, in German, he inscribed a paraphrase from the Bhagavad Gita about the soul persisting beyond physical change. Not citations, just a note. Private, philosophical, veiled. This was no public persona material. The Einstein known around the world, the man of relativity, mass energy equivalence, and quantum skepticism, never mentioned it. Never published it, not even in lectures. This was on a different track altogether. Several months later, during a lecture tour in Oxford, Einstein referenced the continuity of observer state during transitions. He spoke with cautious precision, as if describing a physical phenomenon, not a spiritual revelation. He mentioned that the structure might extend beyond the collapse of physical systems. There was no applause. There was no follow-up. Then silence. Because the implications were profound. If consciousness persists beyond death, then life is not a finite event. It becomes a threshold. Identity becomes a waveform folding into eternity. Death becomes a phase transition, not a terminus. Is that hard to grasp? Harder still to accept, especially when the scientific world depended on neat definitions, on what can be seen, measured, timed, and quantified. For Einstein, identity wasn't a byproduct of neural firing. It was a resonance, a vibration of possibility that could outlast its host. Think of it like this. When a bell stops ringing, its resonance lingers in the air, a distant vibration that outlasts the hammer's strike. Einstein proposed our consciousness could leave such an echo too, a pattern that doesn't vanish. He described the field as subtle, nearly undetectable, but real, something the physics community wasn't looking for. He reportedly tested colleagues with simple thought experiments. If the information of your identity is encoded in and through this field, then even when your body ceases, the configuration remains, available for future detection, reconstitution, or at least influence. This idea anticipated what quantum physicists now suggest, that information is never lost. Even black holes, which absorb everything, eventually emit that information, hawking radiation with encoded shrieks of data. Einstein's field may not appear in equations like E equals mc squared. It doesn't show up in standard models. But conceptually, it aligns with the principle that patterns survive the collapse of structure. He called it the persistence field because he believed it might preserve subjective continuity. It's not just memory, like data in a file archive. its presence preserved. He made notes comparing it to radio waves, how they continue to spread beyond the end of a transmission. The field might be the leftover broadcast of your life. Only it broadcasts not sound, but being. Who else knew? The marginal note shows he shared it with one or two peers, his daughter, his private secretary, maybe someone at the Institute for Advanced Study. But the subject was too sensitive. Papers were never filed. Drafts were never typed up. Over time, the notebooks were boxed, sealed, misfiled, or dismissed. No peer-reviewed journals printed them. No footnotes ever referenced them. They were shelved, ignored, left to fade beneath the established narrative of Einstein the physicist. So, what are you holding on to? The idea that your consciousness, your identity, may reverberate across time, that you might outlast the collapse of your body, that you are not a single equation's solution, but part of a pattern written into the structure of reality. Einstein's persistence field was the beginning of something that transcends physics as we know it. It doesn't end here. Let's move forward. Tucked between the final pages of that same 1925 notebook is something far more dangerous. Not just a theory, but an equation. A new formulation of his famous field equations of general relativity. Except here, the variables didn't just account for mass and energy. This version included something else. A symbol, hand-drawn and circled twice, labeled in shorthand as OC, Observer Continuity. He wasn't vague. He hypothesized that what we call identity, the internal experience of being you, might not be a side effect of the body, but a continuing state. And if that's true, then consciousness doesn't die. It transitions. This wasn't poetry, it was math. He introduced a hypothetical constant, written as lowercase eta, alongside the curvature tensors and spacetime coefficients. It represented continuity across temporal states, not how objects move through space, but how subjectivity persists across thresholds. If matter has inertia, does the observer? He scribbled in the margins. If a particle follows its geodesic across space, what does the self follow across mortality? Then came the comparison. A phase transition. He diagrammed a liquid becoming vapor. Not destruction, but transformation. Beneath the sketch he wrote simply, "Identity reconfigures." At first glance, it reads like mysticism, but it isn't. It's topology, phase space, quantum coherence. The metaphor is unsettling. Physical death in this framework isn't an end. It's a boundary event, a shift in state, not an annihilation. The continuity equation implies the self, whatever that is, traverses that boundary intact, just in a different configuration. Think about what that means. Your sense of self, the thing observing right now, might be a conserved quantity, not generated by the brain, but channeled through it, like electricity through a circuit. And when the circuit fails, the current moves on. Einstein's inclusion of OC wasn't just a creative aside. It altered the structure of the equation. The gravitational model bent subtly, forming what he called a recursive node, a point in the space-time manifold where continuity might loop or extend beyond local time. He didn't finish the math, but he implied a solution, something that would allow for continuity not just within a life, but across lifetimes. At first, this sounds eerily familiar to metaphysical traditions, but look closer. In his notes, Einstein draws parallels, not to Western theology, but to Vedantic philosophy, specifically the Upanishadic idea of the Atman as eternal observer, not the ego, not the body, the witnessing presence behind all forms. He didn't say it explicitly, he didn't have to. There, among the equations, is a line in pencil. Cycle of recurrence cannot be dismissed, only reframed through field invariance. He wasn't talking about physics anymore. He was talking about rebirth. This echoes what near-death researchers today report. Conscious experiences outside time, detached from the physical body, retaining memory, presence, emotion. Many dismiss such accounts as hallucinations. But in Einstein's equation, they have theoretical room to exist. What most people don't realize is that Einstein had correspondences with Indian physicist Satyendra Nath Bose, the same Bose from Bose-Einstein statistics. In one letter, Einstein notes being compelled by metaphysical persistence in Bose's descriptions of non-locality and coherence. He never elaborated publicly, but these equations suggest he was thinking far beyond particles. Now, let's talk about suppression. Einstein's mainstream work was becoming foundational to modern science. He was a symbol of pure rationalism, a walking equation. There was no room for soul constants in that mythology. The few who saw the notebook quietly advised against publication. A letter from 1926 warns, "Speculation of this sort risks undermining the clarity of your contributions." The implication was clear: reputation over revolution. Einstein didn't fight it. The equations were never submitted. The notebook vanished from public view, until fragments were found years later in a sealed drawer at Princeton. But you have to ask, why draft this at all? Why push the limits of field theory to account for consciousness? The answer may be in what he sensed, but couldn't prove: that the universe isn't just matter and energy. It's experience. That what persists is not simply structure, but awareness of structure. This changes everything. If the observer is a constant, if identity survives death like light bends around mass, then what we call self is far older, far stranger, and far more durable than the body it briefly inhabits. And it raises the question: have you lived before? Are the strange attractions in your life, your unexplained fears, dreams, memories, not random, but recursive? Are you encountering things again, not for the first time, but for the next? Einstein's observer equation doesn't just predict cosmic expansion, it predicts internal return. But this isn't common knowledge, because it was never allowed to become public knowledge. All that remains is the sketch, a variable, a discarded equation in a forgotten notebook. But the implications still echo, just like you might, long after this moment ends. And still the revelations deepen. By the time Einstein had scribbled the last variations of his modified field equations, something had shifted, not just in theory, but in practice. He had moved from blackboard to laboratory. And while the world watched him refine relativity, another Einstein, one the public never saw, was quietly overseeing something far more controversial. In 1923, a series of private correspondences began between Albert Einstein and a lesser-known associate, Elsa Bamberger, a physicist and early pioneer in bioelectromagnetic research. They met in Zurich. She had developed a reputation for investigating the unexplained, particularly strange memory phenomena reported by war survivors and psychiatric patients. Einstein wasn't dismissive. He was intrigued. Together, they began what they simply called the Zurich experiments. No institutional oversight, no published protocols, just a lab, a set of EEG machines, and patients who claimed to remember things they had never experienced. One subject, a 38-year-old man, described a medieval village with geographic detail later matched to 14th century German maps. Another, a teenage girl, recalled dying in a fire she never lived through. Patterns emerged. Not delusions, not dreams. Something else. The EEG scans showed sharp electrical bursts in regions of the brain not associated with normal memory retrieval. Even stranger, these bursts corresponded with real-time peaks in the Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural electromagnetic background frequency. Einstein, ever cautious in language, began using a new term in the margins of his notes: non-local identity encoding. The idea that memory, or perhaps soul, was not fixed inside the brain like a hard drive, but more like a radio signal passing through it. He stopped referring to these anomalies as hallucinations. He called them reception events. This notion flipped a century of neuroscience on its head. It implied that what we call personal identity may not be bound by skull and skin. That perhaps, under the right electromagnetic conditions, something old could reawaken inside someone new. Elsa's influence became more visible in the data. Her skill wasn't just in instruments, it was in observation. She noticed that during certain tests, when subjects went into these reception states, their bodies responded as if reliving the moment. Temperature shifts, changes in skin conductivity, even spontaneous tears. It wasn't just that they said they remembered something, their bodies believed it. Einstein drafted internal memos to himself, cautious, speculative, but increasingly clear. He wondered if memory, like light or sound, had a frequency signature, that the brain was less a vault, more an antenna, and that during extreme emotional states, grief, love, trauma, the body briefly tuned into this memory field. He compared this concept to his earlier speculations on field resonance in gravitational physics. But now the field is psychological, or perhaps spiritual. Yet none of this saw the light of day. After 1925, the Zurich experiments ceased. Bamberger returned to private practice. Einstein, under mounting pressure to focus on unified field theory, withdrew from the work. And just like that, it vanished. Or almost. Decades later, a small box of letters was found among Elsa Bamberger's estate, never opened by her family. Inside were handwritten notes, some in Einstein's distinct pen, referencing the continuity variable and identity frequency thresholds. One letter warned, "We must not publish these results, not yet. The world still burns witches." None of the experiments were ever mentioned in Einstein's biographies. Not a line in the collected papers, no citations, no acknowledgement. And yet, here they were, references to patients who may have experienced lives not their own, in frequencies that mirrored planetary harmonics. The implications were staggering. What if memory isn't stored in the brain but tuned into it? What if death doesn't erase identity, but merely interrupts reception? What if the soul isn't a poetic idea, but a kind of signal, one that occasionally finds a new receiver? For Einstein, this wasn't mysticism. It was a side branch of physics too radioactive for its time. A thread that, if pulled too hard, would unravel the entire fabric of modern neuroscience and materialist psychology. He may have buried it, but he didn't destroy it. In one of the final pages recovered from Elsa's files, A single diagram remained, two waveforms drawn on top of each other, one labeled conscious recall, the other, slightly offset, subtler, was simply marked prior. Next to it, Einstein had written a single phrase in the margin: one field, two receivers, one memory, and then nothing. No follow-up notes, no public lectures, no further collaboration. Whatever else Einstein found in Zurich, he carried it in silence. But for those who still listen closely to the edges of what's allowed, that silence speaks volumes. Because perhaps what Einstein feared wasn't that people wouldn't understand. It was that they would, and the moment they did, the veil would begin to tear. The Zurich experiments didn't fail. They simply became too dangerous to continue. Not because the equipment malfunctioned, not because the data was flawed, but because the implications were too clear and too disruptive. By the late 1920s, Einstein had already become more than a scientist. He was an icon, a living emblem of reason, logic, and the triumph of secular physics over the chaos of superstition. Every word he spoke rippled through universities, institutions, and governments alike. So, when the whispers of his private research began to surface, a quiet panic spread among his colleagues. In a series of letters between Einstein and members of the Prussian Academy of Sciences, now sealed but briefly exposed through an estate dispute, one phrase appears multiple times: retain coherence of public legacy. This wasn't a warning about flawed math. It was a containment order. Einstein's interest in memory fields, observer continuity, and non-local consciousness had wandered far beyond the boundaries of acceptable physics. And the academic world noticed. Erwin Schrödinger reportedly confronted Einstein privately in 1930, urging him to preserve the wall between theory and theology. Max Born, a fellow quantum theorist, was more direct. This road leads to the ruin of our credibility. They weren't arguing over numbers. They were defending a paradigm. Post-World War I Europe was desperate to rebuild its identity on the foundations of progress, reason, and science. Mysticism, metaphysics, and anything hinting at the supernatural were labeled as remnants of the old world, dangerous, irrational, and anti-modern. And Einstein, the reluctant prophet of the new era, was being lured back into forbidden territory. The pressure worked. By 1932, Einstein had ceased all documented collaboration with Elsa Bamberger. He shifted his focus to formalized work on unified field theory, something difficult, technical, and safe, something publishable. As for Bamberger herself, the silence became total. She was never mentioned in official publications. Her university affiliation was quietly dissolved. Even her death, under suspicious circumstances in 1947, was never investigated. What remained of her research was boxed, indexed by anonymous archivists, and filed under classifications rarely touched. One such file, recovered by a private researcher in Basel, bore a chilling stamp: not for public release. Bamberger-Einstein Memoranda, Class 9B. Inside were fragments, EEG charts, marginalia, and one partial transcription of a conversation between Einstein and a patient describing a returning presence that had visited through many forms. Why was this buried? Because it wasn't just speculation. It was evidence. Evidence that identity might be more than chemistry, that memory could persist through physical death, that the soul, whatever one calls it, might actually be part of a structured field we don't yet understand. To publish such findings in the 1930s would have done more than invite ridicule. It would have threatened the emerging scientific identity of the West itself. Einstein, for all his rebellious thinking, understood this. He had already been accused of Jewish mysticism by Nazi propagandists. He knew what it meant to live in a time when reason was weaponized, and deviation, especially spiritual deviation, could be fatal. So he chose silence. The observer equation, the Zurich EEGs, the resonance patterns, they remained in his private archive, referenced in passing but never developed further. But here's the part I haven't mentioned. In 1951, 4 years before his death, Einstein sent a final sealed envelope to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. It contained only one note, handwritten and unsigned, placed beneath a carbon copy of a redacted Zurich EEG chart. The note read, "When the world is less afraid of what it cannot measure, open this. It has never been opened. Perhaps it's still waiting." Because the suppression wasn't about protecting Einstein. It was about protecting a framework, one that made space for equations, particles, and planets, but none for the possibility that something might survive death. Not as a metaphor, as a mechanism. And that's the line no one was willing to cross. Because if Einstein was even partially correct, if memory, identity, or consciousness can exist outside the body, then everything changes. It means that death is not deletion. It means your life is not a single file, closed and gone. It means that somewhere, beneath the noise of biology and the silence of forgetting, a signal might still be transmitting. The question isn't why Einstein stopped. The question is, who made sure you never heard he started? And, perhaps more disturbingly, who's still making sure? But let me reveal something to you, something the public was never meant to see. Einstein didn't just question what happens to energy after death. He questioned what happens to you. Because buried within those sealed notes, beneath the equations, the diagrams, the warnings, was a truth so destabilizing, even his closest peers urged him to destroy it. What if consciousness isn't generated, but received? What if your sense of self isn't a spark that begins at birth, but a frequency tuned into by the brain, briefly and then let go? In Einstein's private framework, you don't just matter, you're resonating. Pattern. A persistent field held temporarily in biological form. The body ends, the pattern doesn't. In this light, death isn't a disappearance. It's a change of state, like water turning to vapor. Nothing is lost, only form shifts. And here's the part no one tells you. You may not be starting from zero. What you call instinct, what pulls you without reason, what repeats across decades, those may not be random urges. They may be echoes. What if you've been here before, not as memory, but as momentum? Einstein saw identity not as a creation, but as a continuation. The observer constant implied a through line, a signature that persists across time even when the form changes, not as fantasy, but as field physics. And once you accept that, everything shifts. The fears you carry, the patterns you repeat, the dreams that feel too specific to be imagined. What if these aren't signs of imagination at all? What if they're signs of return? Because if Einstein was right, and identity is a variable in the universe, not a product of the body, then the soul isn't something you earn. It's something you remember. And in this view, healing becomes something else entirely. It's not about building a new self. It's about realigning with a signal that never stops. So, ask yourself, are you becoming someone new, or remembering who you were before forgetting? The ego will resist this. It wants to believe in beginnings and endings. It needs the illusion of finality to feel secure. But what if that's the real illusion? Because in this hidden vision, you are not the bulb. You are the current, and the current never dies. It only looks for a new wire. Not everything Einstein discovered was meant for the public. Some knowledge waits in silence until you're ready to hear it. And just when you think that's the end, there's one more detail, a final letter. Never published, never archived publicly, referenced only once in a footnote from a former assistant. Einstein wrote it just weeks before his death. In it, he described a dream. He was standing at a kind of threshold, not a door, not a wall, but something radiant, vibrating, vast. Beyond it, a field of light, not blinding, but intelligent, as if it knew him, as if it recognized him. And stretched across the sky was an equation, not written in chalk or ink, but formed of motion and memory. It shimmered, shifting between symbols and pure sensation. He wrote that the formula wasn't something I saw, it was something I remembered. That letter vanished. No one knows where it is. Some say it's sealed in a vault beneath Princeton. Others believe it was taken to Zurich, locked inside a private archive under non-disclosure for 100 years. But the whispers persist. They say it wasn't just a dream. They say that the final formula completed the persistence field, the missing variable, the last piece, and that Einstein died knowing something he couldn't publish, not because it wasn't true, but because the world wasn't ready. Maybe it still isn't. Or maybe it's already here, not in a journal, not in a vault, but in you.